Today, we're asking a question most Christians never ask. Before Jesus appeared, what were Jews actually expecting the Messiah to be? A king, a prophet, a deliverer, something even greater? And once we understand that world, we can finally understand why some looked at Yeshua and believed, while others rejected him. My name is the Prophet 33, and I bring you the Word of God. The reason I wear a mask is because I am persecuted in my country for my faith. This mask protects my life. Let's continue. When most Christians hear the word Messiah, they immediately think of Jesus. They think of Bethlehem, the cross, the resurrection, and the New Testament. But a first-century Jew could not think that way. He had never read the New Testament. He knew nothing about church history. He had never heard a sermon about Messianic prophecies being fulfilled in Jesus. He was simply reading the Hebrew Scriptures and asking a question that millions of people before him had asked. What exactly is God going to do? Imagine standing in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. Roman soldiers patrol the streets. The temple still stands. Pilgrims fill the city. The Scriptures are read every Sabbath. The promises of God are known by heart, yet something feels unfinished. God promised an everlasting kingdom to David. God promised restoration through the prophets. God promised justice, peace, and redemption. But where are these things? Why is Israel still under foreign rule? Why does the world still look broken? These questions created an atmosphere of expectation. People were waiting for God to act, waiting for the promises to be fulfilled, waiting for the Messiah. But here's where many modern readers make a mistake. They assume everyone was waiting for exactly the same Messiah. In reality, the picture was much more complicated. Some expected a king, some focused on a prophet like Moses. Some longed for a deliverer who would defeat Israel's enemies. Others emphasized the coming kingdom of God. The Hebrew Scriptures had painted a rich and sometimes mysterious portrait of the future, and not everyone agreed on how the pieces fit together. That raises a fascinating question. If we could travel back in time and ask ordinary Jews living before the birth of Yeshua what they expected the Messiah to be like, what would they actually say? To answer that question, we must do something difficult. We must temporarily forget everything we know about Jesus and return to the Hebrew Scriptures themselves. Because long before anyone had heard of Christianity, long before the New Testament was written, and long before the name Yeshua of Nazareth became known throughout the world, the Jewish people were already searching the Scriptures, looking for clues about a coming Messiah. And what they found may surprise you. One of the biggest obstacles to understanding the Messiah in the first century is that we already know too much about what happened afterward. We know about Christianity. We know about churches, denominations, councils, and 2,000 years of theological debate. We know how the story unfolded, but the people who lived before the appearance of Yeshua knew none of those things. In fact, if you had walked through the streets of Jerusalem and asked people what they were waiting for, nobody would have answered, "We are waiting for Christianity." Nobody was expecting a new religion. Nobody was hoping that God would abandon the story of Israel and start a completely different story. The people of that time were thinking in biblical categories. Their hopes came from the Torah. Their expectations came from the prophets. Their vision of the future was shaped by God's covenant with Abraham, his promises to David, and his repeated declarations that he would one day restore his people. When they thought about redemption, they thought about the fulfillment of those promises. When they thought about the future, they thought about the kingdom of God. When they thought about the Messiah, they imagined someone who would bring God's purposes to completion, not someone who would begin an entirely new religion. This point is incredibly important because it changes the way we read the entire discussion. The question facing first-century Jews was not, will Christianity be true? The question was, how will God fulfill what he has already promised? That is the world we must enter if we want to understand what people were actually expecting. We must stop looking backward through the lens of history and start looking forward through the eyes of those who only had the Hebrew Scriptures. Because once we do that, we discover something fascinating. The Hebrew Bible does not give us a single simple description of the Messiah. Instead, it presents several different portraits that must somehow fit together. And that is exactly where the story becomes interesting. Who was the Messiah supposed to be? A prophet? A king? A deliverer? A ruler over all nations? The answer is not as simple as many people imagine, and it begins with one of the most influential figures in all of Jewish history, Moses. When most people think about the Messiah, they immediately think about a king. That makes sense because many of the most famous Messianic prophecies involve the throne of David and the future kingdom of God. But if we place ourselves in the world of the Hebrew Scriptures, another figure stands just as large in Jewish history, Moses. It is difficult to overstate his importance. Through Moses, God delivered Israel from Egypt. Through Moses, he gave the Torah at Mount Sinai. Through Moses, he established the covenant that would shape the life of the nation for generations. Moses was not merely a prophet among many prophets. He was the prophet against whom all others would be measured. That is why a statement found near the end of Deuteronomy became so important. Moses tells the people, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him." Deuteronomy 18. Those words raised an obvious question. Who is this future prophet? Was Moses simply talking about the prophets who would come after him, such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel? Or was he pointing toward a specific figure still waiting in the future? The question becomes even more interesting when we reach the final chapter of Deuteronomy, where we read, "Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." Deuteronomy 34. Think about the implication. The Torah itself seems to leave the door open. No prophet like Moses had yet appeared. The expectation remained alive, and over the centuries, many Jews continued looking for a prophet who would speak with extraordinary authority and play a unique role in God's plan. This is important because it reminds us that not every Jewish expectation centered on a king. Some people were looking for a prophet, a teacher, a new Moses, someone through whom God would once again act decisively in history. And that expectation existed alongside another hope that became even more influential as the centuries passed: the hope of a future king from the line of David. In fact, if there was one messianic expectation that united the largest number of Jewish readers, it was the belief that God would one day raise up a son of David unlike any king who had come before him. If Moses shaped Israel's understanding of prophecy, David shaped Israel's understanding of kingship. And when it comes to messianic expectation, no figure cast a longer shadow over the Hebrew Scriptures than David. Even centuries after his death, people continued looking back to him as the model of what a king should be. This is remarkable when you think about it. David was not a perfect man. The Bible is brutally honest about his failures. Yet despite those failures, later generations remembered him as the king who united the tribes, established Jerusalem, defeated Israel's enemies, and sought after the heart of God. More importantly, God made David a promise that would shape Jewish expectation for centuries to come. In 2 Samuel 7, the Lord declares, "Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." 2 Samuel 7. At first glance, that sounds straightforward. God is promising that David's royal line will continue. But history created a problem. David died, Solomon died. The kingdom was divided. Jerusalem fell. The temple was destroyed. The descendants of David lost the throne. So what did God mean when he promised an everlasting kingdom? How could David's throne endure forever if no Davidic king was ruling Israel? That question forced generations of Jewish readers to look beyond David himself. The promise seemed too large to be fulfilled by any ordinary king. Somewhere in the future, many concluded, a greater son of David must come, a ruler who would finally accomplish what previous kings had failed to accomplish, a king who would establish justice, a king who would restore God's people, a king whose kingdom would not collapse the way earthly kingdoms always do. This expectation became one of the most powerful themes in Jewish thought. By the first century, many people were not simply waiting for a king. They were waiting for the king, the promised son of David, the ruler through whom God would finally fulfill his covenant promises. Yet the prophets did not merely repeat God's promise to David. They expanded it. They painted a picture of a future ruler so extraordinary that the expectation grew larger with every generation. And perhaps no prophet contributed more to that picture than Isaiah, who described a coming king whose reign would transform not only Israel, but the world itself. When people think about Messianic prophecy, one of the first names that usually comes to mind is Isaiah, and for good reason. More than 700 years before the birth of Yeshua, Isaiah described a future ruler in language that captured the imagination of generations of Jewish readers. What makes Isaiah especially interesting is that he was not writing during a time of peace and stability. The nation faced uncertainty, political turmoil, and the growing threat of powerful empires. Yet instead of focusing only on the crisis of his own day, Isaiah repeatedly pointed his audience toward a future that God himself would bring about. One of the most famous examples appears in Isaiah 11. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. Isaiah 11. Jesse was David's father, so Isaiah is clearly speaking about a future descendant of David. But notice the imagery. David's royal line is described as a stump. Something that once appeared strong has been cut down. Yet from that seemingly hopeless situation, new life emerges. A future ruler, a future king. And Isaiah immediately tells us that this king will be unlike any ordinary ruler. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. Isaiah 11. He will rule with wisdom. He will judge with righteousness. He will defend the poor. He will not be deceived by appearances. In a world full of corrupt leaders, Isaiah describes a king who perfectly reflects God's own standards of justice. But then the prophecy becomes even more remarkable. Isaiah does not merely describe political reform. He describes a transformed world, a world characterized by peace, righteousness, and the knowledge of God. He concludes by declaring that the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Isaiah 11. At this point, the Messianic expectation has clearly expanded beyond the idea of a national ruler. The future king is connected to something much larger than Israel's political independence. He is associated with the restoration of creation itself. The reign of this king will affect not only Israel, but the nations, not only society, but the world. This is one of the reasons Isaiah became so influential in Jewish Messianic thought. He presented a vision of the future that was both deeply rooted in David's covenant and breathtakingly universal in scope. Yet Isaiah was not the only prophet to expand the picture. Several centuries later, another prophet would describe a figure whose authority stretched even further, a figure associated not merely with Israel, but with all peoples and all nations. To find him, we must turn to one of the most mysterious visions in the entire Hebrew Bible, Daniel's vision of the Son of Man. If Isaiah expanded the vision of the Messiah beyond the borders of Israel, Daniel pushed it even further. His prophecies introduced a figure so mysterious and so extraordinary that they would become some of the most discussed passages in Jewish and Christian history. Daniel lived during a time when Israel was under foreign domination, and much of his book deals with the rise and fall of powerful empires. Kingdoms appear strong, rulers seem unstoppable, nations dominate the world stage, yet Daniel repeatedly reminds his readers that human empires are temporary. No matter how powerful they appear, they eventually pass away. Then, in Daniel chapter 7, the focus suddenly shifts from earthly kingdoms to a heavenly vision. Daniel writes, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven." Daniel 7. For Jewish readers, this image was striking. Here's a figure who appears human. Yet, he approaches the Ancient of Days and receives something astonishing. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. Daniel 7. Think about how different this is from the expectations we have already examined. The prophet like Moses focuses on authority and revelation. The son of David focuses on kingship and covenant. Isaiah's righteous king brings justice and peace. But Daniel introduces a figure whose authority extends over all nations and whose kingdom outlasts every empire in history. Babylon falls. Persia falls. Greece falls. Rome will eventually fall. But the kingdom described by Daniel never ends. This vision became incredibly important because it connected the Messianic hope to something much larger than national restoration. The future ruler would not simply reign over Israel. His authority would reach the nations. His kingdom would endure forever. His role would be connected to God's ultimate plan for history itself. By now, you can begin to see why the Messianic question was not simple. The Hebrew Scriptures did not provide a single sentence describing the Messiah. They provided a collection of portraits, a prophet like Moses, a son of David, a righteous king, a mysterious son of man whose kingdom would never end. The challenge was figuring out how all these pieces fit together. And as the centuries passed, that challenge became even more urgent, because the Jewish people were not studying these prophecies in a vacuum. They were living under foreign rule. They were waiting for God to act. And by the time Rome occupied the land, Messianic expectation had reached a level unlike anything Israel had experienced before. The question was no longer whether God would fulfill his promises. The question was when and what the Messiah would actually look like when he arrived. By the time we reach the first century, it becomes easier to understand why Messianic expectation was so intense. For hundreds of years, Jewish readers had been studying promises like the ones we have just examined. They had read about a prophet like Moses. They had read about a son of David whose kingdom would endure forever. They had read Isaiah's vision of a righteous ruler and Daniel's vision of an everlasting kingdom. And yet the world around them looked very different from the world those prophecies seemed to describe. Israel was not experiencing the age of peace envisioned by the prophets. The nations had not fully turned to the God of Israel. The kingdom of David had not been restored. Instead, the Jewish people found themselves living under the authority of Rome. Roman soldiers patrolled their streets. Roman officials collected taxes. Roman power seemed to dominate the known world. The contrast between God's promises and daily reality created a growing sense that history was moving toward a decisive moment. Many Jews believed they were living near a turning point. The promises had existed for centuries. The waiting had lasted for generations. Surely God would act soon. This helps explain why discussions about the Messiah became so widespread during this period. People were not merely debating theology, they were discussing the future of Israel, the future of the world, and the fulfillment of God's covenant promises. But something else was happening as well. As different groups studied the scriptures, they sometimes reached different conclusions. Everyone agreed that God would fulfill his promises. Everyone agreed that a great act of redemption lay in the future. The disagreement centered on what that redemption would actually look like. And that is where the story becomes even more interesting. Because by the first century, not everyone was expecting exactly the same Messiah. In fact, some Jewish groups were expecting very different things altogether. One of the most common misconceptions about the first century is the idea that all Jews shared a single, unified expectation of the Messiah. The reality was much more complicated. The Jewish people agreed on the authority of the scriptures, but they did not always agree on how those scriptures should be interpreted. After all, the Hebrew Bible presents a rich and complex picture of the future. The Messiah appears as a prophet like Moses. He appears as a son of David. He appears as a righteous king. He appears as a shepherd. Daniel describes a mysterious son of man receiving authority over all nations. And then there are passages that speak about suffering, rejection, and redemption. The challenge was obvious. How were all these descriptions supposed to fit together? Some people emphasized the royal passages. They focused on the coming son of David and expected a ruler who would restore Israel's kingdom. Others paid closer attention to prophetic themes and looked for a figure who would speak with unique authority on behalf of God. Still others were fascinated by apocalyptic visions, such as those found in Daniel, and expected dramatic divine intervention that would transform the world. As a result, Messianic expectation was not a single idea shared by everyone in exactly the same way. It was an ongoing conversation taking place throughout the Jewish world. The most fascinating evidence comes from writings produced during the Second Temple period, including some of the texts discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. These writings reveal that certain Jewish groups may have expected more than one messianic figure. Rather than combining every prophecy into a single person, they envisioned different anointed leaders fulfilling different roles in God's plan. Not all Jews believe this, of course, but it demonstrates how seriously people were wrestling with the scriptures. They were trying to understand how all the pieces fit together. And that brings us to one of the most important problems in the entire Messianic discussion. Because among all the various expectations, there was one tension that nobody seemed able to fully resolve. On the one hand, the prophets described a victorious ruler, a king who would reign, judge, and establish God's kingdom. On the other hand, there were passages that seemed to describe suffering, rejection, and humiliation. How could both pictures be true at the same time? That question would become one of the greatest puzzles in Jewish messianic thought long before the appearance of Yeshua. As we have seen, the Hebrew scriptures contain several portraits of the coming Messiah. But among all those portraits, one tension stands above the rest. In fact, it may have been the greatest messianic puzzle in the entire Bible. On one side stood the promises of victory. The Messiah would be a son of David. He would inherit an everlasting kingdom. He would establish justice. He would rule the nations. He would bring peace and restoration. These passages created the expectation of a powerful ruler who would fulfill God's promises and transform the world. It is not difficult to understand why many Jews focused on these prophecies. They are clear, inspiring, and filled with hope. But then there were other passages that seemed to point in a very different direction. Instead of glory, they spoke of suffering. Instead of triumph, they spoke of rejection. Instead of a king seated on a throne, they described someone who was despised, afflicted, and misunderstood. The most famous example appears in Isaiah 53. There we encounter a mysterious servant who is rejected by men, suffers greatly, and bears the sins of others. For centuries, Jewish interpreters debated the identity of this servant. Some understood the passage collectively, seeing the servant as Israel itself. Others proposed different interpretations. Whatever conclusion people reached, one thing was clear. The picture did not seem to fit neatly alongside the image of the conquering king. How could the Messiah rule forever if he suffered? How could the victorious son of David be rejected? How could the ruler of Daniel's everlasting kingdom also be associated with affliction and humiliation? These were not questions created by Christianity. They already existed within the Hebrew scriptures themselves. The prophets had presented two powerful themes, and bringing them together was not easy. Some readers emphasized the victorious passages and paid less attention to the suffering ones. Others wrestled with both and searched for explanations. But no interpretation solved every difficulty perfectly. By the first century, the puzzle remained. The scriptures seemed to point in two directions at once: a king and suffering, glory and rejection, triumph and affliction. How could these realities possibly fit together? And that is what makes the arrival of Yeshua so significant. Because whether one ultimately accepts or rejects his messianic claims, there is no question that his life forced people to confront this ancient tension in a completely new way. Suddenly, the discussion was no longer theoretical. The question was no longer, how might these prophecies fit together? The question became, what do we do with this man from Nazareth? And that question divided the Jewish world in ways few could have imagined. After centuries of waiting, debating, studying, and hoping, a Jewish teacher from a small town in Galilee suddenly stepped onto the stage of history. At first glance, there was nothing about him that seemed likely to change the world. He was not born into a royal palace. He did not command an army. He did not hold political office. He did not lead a revolution against Rome. Yet within a remarkably short period of time, people throughout the land began asking a question that had been asked about no ordinary man. Could this be the Messiah? The reason the question emerged so quickly is that Yeshua did not appear in a vacuum. He entered a world already filled with messianic expectation. People were already waiting for a prophet, already waiting for a son of David, already waiting for God's kingdom, already searching the scriptures for signs that the promises of the prophets were nearing fulfillment. In many ways, the stage had already been set long before he was born. And as his ministry unfolded, people began noticing things that seemed strangely familiar. He spoke with unusual authority. He taught the scriptures in ways that captured the attention of ordinary people and challenged established leaders. He spoke constantly about the kingdom of God. He gathered disciples around himself. He performed acts that many viewed as signs of divine power. And perhaps most importantly, he forced people to make a decision. Neutrality became difficult. Some became convinced that God was working through him in an extraordinary way. Others remained skeptical. Still others became openly hostile. What makes the story so fascinating is that both belief and unbelief often grew out of the same messianic expectations we have been discussing throughout this video. Those expectations did not disappear when Yeshua arrived. They became the very lens through which people evaluated him. Some looked at him and saw the prophet like Moses they had been waiting for. Some saw the son of David. Some saw signs that God's kingdom was drawing near. But others looked at the same man and saw reasons for doubt. After all, where was the restored kingdom? Where was the defeat of Israel's enemies? Where was the visible fulfillment of the prophecies about national restoration? The very expectations that led some people toward faith led others toward skepticism. And that is one of the most important things to understand about the first century. The debate was not primarily between people who cared about the scriptures and people who did not. Very often it was between people who cared deeply about the same scriptures, but disagreed about what they were seeing unfold before their eyes. And nowhere was that disagreement more obvious than in one issue that many viewed as impossible to overcome: the cross. If there was one event that seemed capable of destroying every messianic claim, it was the crucifixion. To modern Christians, the cross is a symbol of faith, hope, and salvation. We see it through the lens of 2,000 years of history. But that is not how people in the first century would have seen it. To them, crucifixion was a public humiliation, a punishment reserved for criminals, rebels, and those Rome wished to make an example of. It was designed not only to kill a person, but to shame him. That is why the crucifixion of Yeshua created such a profound challenge. Think about the expectations we have discussed throughout this video. The Messiah was expected to be a son of David, a ruler, a deliverer, a king associated with God's kingdom. Yet here was a man hanging on a Roman cross. To many observers, that appeared to settle the question. A dead Messiah sounded like a contradiction in terms. If the Messiah was supposed to defeat Israel's enemies, how could he be executed by them? If the Messiah was supposed to establish God's kingdom, how could he end up condemned and crucified? If the Messiah was supposed to rule, why did Rome appear to have the final word? These were not unreasonable questions. In fact, they were exactly the questions many people asked. The cross did not merely challenge messianic expectations. It seemed to shatter them. And this helps explain why so many people rejected the idea that Yeshua could be the Messiah. Their conclusion was not necessarily based on ignorance or hostility toward the scriptures. Quite often it was based on the very expectations those scriptures had created. The Messiah was supposed to win. Yeshua had been crucified. Case closed, or so it seemed. Yet for his followers, something happened that changed the entire discussion. They became convinced that the crucifixion was not the end of the story. They believed that God had raised Yeshua from the dead. And if that claim were true, then the cross no longer represented defeat. It represented something else entirely. Suddenly, passages that had seemed difficult to reconcile with the image of a victorious Messiah began to look different. The tension between suffering and glory did not disappear, but it could be understood in a new way. For the followers of Yeshua, the cross became the key that unlocked the puzzle. For many others, however, the puzzle remained unsolved, and that is why the debate did not end in the first century. In many ways, it continues to this very day. The same scriptures are still being read, the same promises are still being discussed, and the same question remains at the center of the conversation. What were the prophets really saying about the Messiah? I want to take a moment to thank everyone who has already become a channel member through YouTube memberships. Your support truly helps me continue creating this content and building a spiritually meaningful community. If you feel connected and would like to support the vision, you can join by clicking the link in the description. It's simple, secure, and handled directly by YouTube. Thank you for being part of this journey. After everything we have explored, we can finally return to the question that inspired this entire discussion. What were Jews actually expecting before the coming of Yeshua? The answer is both simpler and more complicated than many people realize. Simpler because there are certain themes that appear again and again throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. More complicated because those themes do not always fit together as neatly as we might expect. The Jewish people were waiting for God to fulfill his promises. They were waiting for a prophet like Moses. They were waiting for a son of David. They were waiting for a ruler who would establish justice, restore God's people, and bring his kingdom into history. They were waiting for redemption. They were waiting for restoration. They were waiting for God to act. But they were not all waiting for exactly the same thing in exactly the same way. Some focused on the royal promises. Others emphasized prophetic expectations. Some looked for national restoration. Others concentrated on broader visions of God's kingdom. The Hebrew Scriptures had painted a rich and multi-layered portrait, and faithful readers spent centuries trying to understand how all the pieces fit together. This is why it is inaccurate to speak as though there was one single messianic expectation shared by every Jew in the first century. The reality was far more dynamic. There was broad agreement about the promises, but there was often disagreement about their fulfillment. And perhaps nowhere was that tension more visible than in the relationship between the victorious king and the suffering servant. The Scriptures seemed to point in both directions. They spoke of glory and suffering, authority and rejection, triumph and affliction. The challenge was understanding how these themes could coexist. That challenge existed before Yeshua appeared, and it continued after his arrival. Some believed his life, death, and resurrection provided the missing piece that brought the prophecies together. Others remained unconvinced and continued waiting for a future fulfillment. What is undeniable, however, is that the debate did not begin with Christianity. It began within the pages of the Hebrew Scriptures themselves. The questions were already there. The expectations were already there. The longing was already there. Long before the New Testament was written, Jewish readers were wrestling with these promises and asking how God would ultimately fulfill them. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. The story of the Messiah did not begin in Bethlehem. It did not begin in the Gospels. It began centuries earlier in the hopes, promises, prophecies, and expectations that shaped the Jewish world. Whether one ultimately accepts Yeshua as the Messiah or not, understanding those expectations helps us see the New Testament through the eyes of the people who first encountered him. And once we do that, the story becomes richer, deeper, and far more fascinating than many of us ever imagined. You might be wondering why any of this matters today. After all, the debates we have discussed took place nearly 2,000 years ago. Empires have risen and fallen. Nations have changed. Entire civilizations have come and gone. Yet, the question of the Messiah remains remarkably relevant because it forces us to ask a deeper question. Are we willing to understand the Bible on its own terms? Too often, people approach the Scriptures carrying assumptions they inherited from their culture, their tradition, or their religious background. But the world of the Bible was a Jewish world. The promises were given to Israel. The prophets spoke to Israel. The expectations surrounding the Messiah emerged from Israel's Scriptures. When we take the time to understand those expectations, we begin to see the biblical story with greater clarity. We discover that the New Testament did not appear out of nowhere. It emerged from an ongoing conversation that had been unfolding for centuries. We see why certain questions were being asked, why certain passages were so important, and why the arrival of Yeshua generated such intense reactions. We also gain a greater appreciation for the depth and complexity of the Hebrew Scriptures themselves. Rather than presenting a simplistic picture of the future, they invite readers into a profound exploration of God's purposes for humanity, Israel, and the world. And perhaps that is the greatest takeaway from this entire discussion. The Messiah was never a random idea added to the story at the last minute. The expectation was woven into the fabric of the biblical narrative long before the first century. Generation after generation looked forward, searched the Scriptures, and waited for God to fulfill his promises. The debate over how those promises should be understood continues even today. But one fact remains undeniable. Long before anyone had heard the name Jesus of Nazareth, the Jewish people were already asking one of the most important questions in history. When God finally sends his Messiah, what will he be like? And that question, more than anything else, is what led us on this journey through the Scriptures. As we come to the end of this study, it is worth remembering where we began. We started with a simple question. What were Jews actually expecting before the coming of Yeshua? Along the way, we discovered that the answer is far richer than many people imagine. The Hebrew Scriptures did not present a single, simple portrait of the Messiah. They presented a tapestry, a prophet like Moses, a son of David, a righteous king, a shepherd, a deliverer, a mysterious son of man whose kingdom would never end. These expectations shaped the Jewish world for centuries. They fueled hope during times of suffering. They sustained faith during foreign occupation. They caused generations of people to search the Scriptures and look toward the future. By the first century, the expectation of God's intervention had become deeply woven into Jewish life. People were waiting for redemption, waiting for restoration, waiting for the fulfillment of God's promises. And when Yeshua appeared, those expectations did not disappear. They became the very lens through which people evaluated him. Some became convinced that the promises were being fulfilled before their eyes. Others believed important expectations remained unmet. The debate that followed was not born out of ignorance of the Scriptures. It was born out of deep engagement with them. And in many ways, that debate continues today. But regardless of where one stands on the question, understanding the Messianic expectations that existed before Jesus allows us to read the Bible with fresh eyes. It reminds us that the story did not begin in the New Testament. It began centuries earlier in the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. It began with promises, hopes, and questions that shaped the world into which Yeshua was born. And perhaps the most remarkable thing of all is that those ancient questions still have the power to challenge us today. Because whenever we open the Scriptures, we find ourselves standing alongside generations of readers who ask the same question: how will God fulfill his promises? For the people of the first century, that question centered on the Messiah. And whether we approach the subject as believers, skeptics, students, or seekers, understanding what they were expecting is the first step toward understanding one of the most influential figures in human history. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching and being part of this journey with me. Now I invite you to check out this recommended video right here. And if you're hungry for more eye-opening content, hit the subscribe button, and let's keep learning together.